Look down at your feet. Right now, they are probably wrapped in soft cushions, fabric, and rubber. Your pinky toe is small, fragile, and neatly shielded from reality. But if you wake up 40,000 years ago, that protective capsule disappears. You step directly onto jagged volcanic stone or shifting ice sheets completely exposed. Out here, a single deep laceration isn't an inconvenience. It's a death sentence. And your skeleton still carries the exact scar of the moment we decided we couldn't take it anymore. For most of human history, the Earth was not a paved surface. It was an endless, unforgiving obstacle course of thorn scrub, razor-sharp flint shards, frost-bitten mud, and blazing sands. Every single mile traveled required an intense physical negotiation between the bare skin of your soles and the raw geography of the planet. Yet, if you look at archaeological museums, you will notice a frustrating, massive void. Stone tools survive for millions of years. Bronze axes can withstand the collapse of civilizations. But a prehistoric shoe, a fragile envelope crafted from cured animal hide, wrapped with delicate dried plant fibers or sinew, simply rots. It breaks down in the soil, dissolves under moisture, and vanishes within a few short centuries. For generations of scientists, this created a profound evolutionary black box. We knew that our ancestors had eventually conquered the coldest corners of Eurasia, pushing deep into Ice Age mammoth steppes where exposed flesh would freeze solid in minutes. They must have had footwear. But because the actual materials had vanished back into the earth, we had no way of knowing exactly when humanity formally stepped out of the wilderness and into the first shoes. Until researchers stopped digging for old leather and started looking directly at the human body. In the early 2000s, a physical anthropologist named Eric Trinkaus noticed something strange while analyzing Upper Paleolithic human skeletons. He wasn't looking at skulls or jaws or heavy brow ridges. He was looking at the tiny, delicate bones inside the human foot. Specifically, the proximal phalanges, the small bones that form the base of your lesser toes. When you compare these bones across human history, the timeline does not move along a smooth, predictable line. Instead, it hits a sudden, jarring architectural drop. Skeletons from the Middle Paleolithic, dating back over 50,000 years, consistently feature thick, robust, highly developed toe bones. These were the feet of powerful, world-class barefoot athletes. Their toes were broad, anchored firmly to the ground, designed to grip, absorb, and push off the earth with tremendous mechanical force. But past the threshold of roughly 40,000 years ago, and those minor toe bones suddenly begin to shrink. They grow thin. They become fragile. Their structural mass collapses. This anatomical downsizing was not a random genetic malfunction. It was the biological response to an artificial intervention. When you walk completely barefoot across the earth, your feet must do extraordinary structural work. Every strike against the ground forces your toes to spread, grip, and balance the weight of your entire body. To handle that daily mechanical trauma, natural selection builds thick, rigid bones. Your toes become dense out of pure architectural necessity. But the moment you wrap that foot in a thick layer of cured animal hide, everything changes. The shoe begins to absorb the impact of the ground. The leather chassis takes over the work of stabilization. The toes no longer need to claw at the earth to maintain balance. In the cold, mathematical calculus of evolution, bone mass is an expensive asset. It requires significant amounts of calcium, metabolic energy, and nutrients to build and maintain. If the body discovers that an external technology is doing the work for it, it doesn't keep wasting resources on redundant armor. It downsizes. Trinkaus realized that the shrinking of our ancestors' toe bones wasn't evidence that their bodies were wearing out. It was the definitive, invisible signature of the first shoes. By looking at exactly when the bone mass dropped, he could pinpoint when humanity entered the shod era, and that date lands squarely in the Upper Paleolithic, right around 40,000 years ago. But why then? Humanity had been walking the earth for hundreds of thousands of years prior without needing an external soul. The change wasn't driven by a sudden spike in vanity. It was driven by a radical, unprecedented shift in the global climate. The Earth was plunging deep into the last glacial maximum. Vast ice sheets were crawling down across Europe and northern Asia, locking up the world's water and transforming lush landscapes into frozen, wind-blasted tundras. The ancestors who had successfully migrated out of Africa were suddenly trapped in a freezing vise. Exposed skin on a sub-zero steppe wasn't just painful. It meant frostbite, tissue necrosis, and loss of mobility within a single afternoon. And out here, a loss of mobility meant immediate death. If an Ice Age hunter lost the use of their feet, they couldn't pursue the mammoth herds. They couldn't gather firewood. They became a catastrophic burden to a small, mobile band struggling to survive. To conquer this frozen frontier, the human mind had to do what the human body couldn't. It had to engineer an artificial microclimate. The first shoes were likely simple but highly effective systems. Bags of cured hide stuffed with dried grass or moss for insulation, tied tightly around the ankle with sinew. They were crude, ungainly, and deeply functional. But they completely bypassed the millions of years it normally takes for evolution to modify a mammal's anatomy. We didn't wait to grow thicker skin or internal insulation. We manufactured it. This technological insulation didn't just shield us from the freezing tundra, it fundamentally re-engineered the mechanics of the human stride. When you sprint barefoot across a modern grass field or a prehistoric dirt track, your body operates on an ancient biomechanical program. You naturally land on your forefoot or midfoot. Your toes splay wide, acting like a natural chassis that dampens the initial impact. The arches of your feet collapse slightly and spring back up, storing kinetic energy like a biological rubber band. It is an incredibly efficient, low-impact system developed across millions of years of hominid evolution. But the moment you strap a thick, rigid sole onto your heel, that ancient software crashes. A cushioned base encourages a completely different movement profile, the heel strike. Instead of landing lightly on the front of the foot, you drive your heel straight into the ground with every single step. The soft fat pad under your calcaneus bone takes a direct hit. Because the shoe protects the skin from immediate pain, the brain allows you to deliver massive, repetitive shocks directly up into your skeletal structure. The kinetic wave travels through your ankle, shoots up your shin, pounds against your knee joints, and radiates directly into your lower spine. By insulating the foot, we essentially muted the sensory nerves that tell the body how to balance itself. Your foot contains over 200,000 nerve endings, one of the highest densities anywhere on the human body. They are not there by accident. They are data collectors. They read the texture of the soil, calculate the tilt of the landscape, and send real-time reports to your central nervous system so your leg muscles can adjust their tension mid-stride. Wrapping that sophisticated sensory panel in thick leather is the physiological equivalent of putting a blindfold over your foot's eyes. The muscles inside the arch stop firing. The complex network of ligaments begins to atrophy. What was once a highly dynamic, spring-loaded masterpiece of kinetic engineering gradually becomes a rigid, passive block inside a leather box. This biomechanical transformation happened remarkably fast. Skeletons from the late Upper Paleolithic show changes that go far beyond thin toe bones. The bones of the lower leg, the tibia and fibula, show subtle structural adjustments that track a shift in how weight was distributed during the stride. The human body was adapting to its own technology, reshaping itself to fit the artificial platforms it had built. And as our feet grew softer and our technology grew better, it unlocked a migration capacity that no other primate had ever possessed. Armed with this portable geographic barrier, our ancestors did something no other primate had ever achieved. They broke out of their natural ecological envelope. For millions of years, hominid survival was heavily locked to climate. If the landscape was too cold, you froze. If the terrain was too jagged, your mobility dropped to zero. But shoes turned global geography from an executioner into a highway. We didn't just survive the Upper Paleolithic Ice Age, we weaponized our technology to conquer it. Humans pushed deep into the frozen heart of Siberia, crossed the wind-blasted mammoth steppes, and eventually scaled the Bering Land Bridge to step into the Americas. A journey of thousands of miles, undertaken entirely on a thin layer of manufactured leather. Compare this with our closest evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals. They were physically magnificent. They were heavily built, deeply muscular, and had lived in the cold climates of Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived. Their bodies were biologically optimized for low temperatures in ways ours simply weren't. Yet, when you look at the Neanderthal fossil record, their foot bones tell a radically different story. Their toes remained thick, robust, and completely unmodified until the very end of their lineage. Neanderthals never developed thinned phalanges. They never showed the anatomical signature of the shod stride. For all their physical strength, they remained fundamentally barefoot primates. They fought the elements with anatomy, while modern humans fought the elements with culture. When the climate collapsed into maximum severity, the biological approach hit a hard physical limit. The cultural approach did not. Because our earliest leather envelopes disintegrated, finding the oldest physical shoe remains a forensic obsession. The record is full of extraordinary survivors that managed to cheat the normal laws of decay. In a cave in Oregon, archaeologists uncovered the Fort Rock sandals. Dozens of beautifully woven shoes crafted from sagebrush bark, preserved perfectly beneath a layer of volcanic ash for over 10,000 years. In a dry cave in Armenia, researchers found the Irini 1 shoe, a single piece of cowhide stitched with a leather cord and stuffed with grass for insulation, dating back 5,500 years. It looks shockingly modern, featuring a tailored contour that perfectly wrapped the foot of its owner. But these structural marvels are not the true origin. They are the highly polished descendants of a technology that was already tens of thousands of years old. The woven sandals and stitched leather shoes are just the visible tip of an evolutionary iceberg that began when an Ice Age hunter thinned their bones to keep their body moving. Once you survive by externalizing protection into technology, evolution no longer has to solve every problem with anatomy. The true scale of this biological surrender didn't hit its peak until we stopped moving across the wild landscape entirely. Enter the Neolithic Revolution. Around 12,000 years ago, humanity gradually abandoned the tracking of mammoth herds and settled down into permanent agricultural villages. This transition completely re-engineered human diet, society, and tool-making. But it also radically transformed the physical texture of the spaces we inhabited. For millions of years, the earth was organic. It shifted underfoot. It possessed texture, compliance, and variation. If you stepped on a root, your foot bent sideways. If you walked on sand, your heel sank, forcing your calf muscles to stabilize your weight. The natural landscape was a hyperdynamic fitness gym for human ligaments. But when we built permanent settlements, we introduced a biomechanical horror, the flat surface. Suddenly, humans were no longer walking on conforming soils. We were walking on packed clay floors, cut stone flagstones, and paved brick pathways. To a foot engineered by natural selection to handle complex, chaotic topographies, a perfectly flat floor is an architectural anomaly. When you step on a hard, unyielding surface, the impact forces the foot to behave with forensic repetition. The heel strikes the exact same way, at the exact same angle, every single time. The load is distributed across the exact same square millimeters of bone and soft tissue, thousands of times a day, day after day, year after year. This static repetition is the foundation of the modern evolutionary mismatch. To protect ourselves from the localized pain of this new, artificial geography, shoes evolved from soft protective envelopes into rigid, defensive structural platforms. We added wooden soles. We added stacked leather heels. We engineered stiff arches designed to support the foot from the outside. And by inserting that rigid barrier between ourselves and our own flat creations, we effectively finalized the eviction of the foot from its natural biological role. The internal muscles that were supposed to cushion the stride simply gave up. They went dark. The dynamic biological spring was replaced by a structural crutch. Today, this evolutionary mismatch manifests as a massive multi-billion-dollar medical industry dedicated to saving our lower limbs from the world we built. We spend fortunes on custom orthotics, gel cushions, heel cups, and motion control sneakers, all trying to manage conditions that were virtually non-existent in our barefoot ancestors. Plantar fasciitis, bunions, collapsed arches, and chronic lower back fatigue are not standard human equipment. They are the mechanical taxes we pay for insisting on walking through a world of flat lines with a body built for curves. Your ancestors didn't have weak arches because their world didn't permit them to be lazy. The industrial scale of this misalignment reached its ultimate, chaotic peak when footwear transitioned from a tool of environmental survival to an instrument of social signaling. In the modern era, factories began churning out millions of identical, rigid boxes designed not to fit the complex biological shape of a human foot, but to conform to the dictates of mass production and changing aesthetic trends. The biological foot is widest at the toes. It tapers back toward the heel. Yet, walk into any shoe store today, and you will see row after row of platforms that do the exact opposite. They feature narrow, pointed toe boxes that compress your digits into a cramped, unnatural wedge. When you force a dynamic primate foot into a static, pointed container, the anatomy breaks down in predictable, horrific ways. The big toe is physically diverted inward. The joint at its base is pushed outward, rubbing against the rigid material of the wall until the body builds a protective, agonizing layer of bone deposit. We call them bunions. To an evolutionary biologist, a bunion is not a random disease of old age. It is a physical deformity caused by forcing an elastic, living structure to live inside a hostile, industrial mold. And then came the absolute pinnacle of anatomical absurdity, the elevated heel. For millions of years, human bipedalism depended on a perfectly level architecture. Your calcaneus bone and your metatarsals were designed to share the burden of your weight equally, maintaining a straight alignment through the ankle and up into the pelvis. Raising the heel, even by a few fractions of an inch, throws that entire balance into chaos. Your center of gravity shifts forward. To keep from falling flat on your face, your knees must bend slightly, your pelvis tilts forward, and your lower back arches into an unnatural, strained curve. The complex calf muscles, built to contract and stretch dynamically to power your stride, are forced into a permanent, shortened state of tension. Spend decades walking on elevated heels, and your tendons physically adapt to that shortened position. Strip the shoe away, step flat onto the bare floor, and the sudden stretch triggers a sharp, blinding wave of agony. The tool we built to protect our feet has effectively rendered us prisoners of its own design. This is the ultimate irony of our modern relationship with footwear. We began our shod journey as a desperate, brilliant act of survival on the frozen steppes of the Ice Age. We used culture to conquer geography, wrapping our feet in hides to insulate ourselves from sub-zero winds and jagged stone. It was a massive evolutionary payoff. But we didn't stop once the emergency ended. We kept upgrading the technology until the technology began downgrading us. We built a world of flat lines, covered our souls in synthetic armor, and systematically muted the sensory loop that keeps our bodies aligned with the planet. Look at your pinky toe again. That tiny, curved, seemingly useless digit is actually a historical monument. It is the living anatomical evidence of a Faustian bargain our ancestors struck with the Upper Paleolithic ice. We traded our structural independence for planetary dominance. We chose to externalize our physical protection into technology, and in doing so, we handed the keys of our own skeletal morphology over to our tailors and cobblers. This creates the final, profound irony of the modern human condition. We are an elite endurance primate designed by millions of years of natural selection to sprint barefoot across dynamic landscapes. Yet we have systematically engineered a world where that endurance is entirely optional and our built-in equipment is rendered helpless by its own success. A chimpanzee without its coat faces an immediate, lethal crisis. A modern human without their sneakers faces an immediate trip to the podiatrist. We did not conquer the planet by growing better armor. We conquered it by inventing a portable substitute and convincing our bodies that the raw earth was something to be feared. And yet, the ancient survival software never truly disappeared completely. Step barefoot onto a patch of wet grass, shifting sand, or damp soil first thing in the morning, and you can feel the sophisticated sensory panel inside your soles instantly fire back up, the 200,000 nerve endings awake. The complex network of muscles and ligaments inside your arch, long dormant inside their cushioned vault, immediately begin to flex, contract, and stabilize your weight. Your posture shifts, your knees adjust, your lower spine realigns itself. For a brief, fleeting second, your central nervous system remembers exactly what it was designed to do before we ruined everything with flat concrete and synthetic rubber padding. We are not cleanly separated from the world-class barefoot athletes who tracked megafauna across the ancient landscapes of deep time. We are modified apes, still carrying the ghost marks of a life lived in direct, uninsulated contact with the geography of the earth. Evolution does not strip a mammal down or downsize its bone mass unless the survival payoff is absolutely staggering. In our case, the payoff was the inheritance of the entire planet. Losing our robust feet let us cross the ice sheets, navigate the jagged mountain passes, outlast the changing seasons, and ultimately build the very civilizations that now keep us safe from the wild. So, if you want the shortest answer to why we wear shoes, here it is. Look down at your feet one last time. That soft skin, those thinned bones, and that fragile pinky toe are actually the exact reason your ancestors kept running across the changing landscapes of deep time when the rest of the world had to stop. You wear shoes today because without them, you wouldn't be standing here at all.